Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. I read a comment in our Facebook group. It's called Intuitive Awakening. And I read a comment that struck me that I hadn't anticipated seeing this in print ever. The person was responding to a comment. I don't even remember what the subject was, but they were responding by saying that most people use Myers-Briggs for personal development, and they don't get much beyond the first two cognitive functions. And I was completely surprised that somebody made the claim that most people use Myers-Briggs for personal development. That's certainly not the case, or wasn't the case even 10 years ago. Moving into personal growth and personal development in this arena has become such a given now. Like, that's how a lot of people are using typology tools and Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram. Well, Enneagram's a little different, but the idea that people are using Myers-Briggs for personal growth and development is fascinating to me. Now, I'm not 100% convinced that's accurate. There's a lot of people that are into the system just for the system. And I would argue that most people are that way. Most people are using Myers-Briggs to understand themselves and understand their wiring and understand other people's wiring. But I like the idea that it's become it's become such a part of the ecosystem that there's a big space for using the system in personal growth. The other part was the idea that most people aren't that familiar beyond their first two functions. And that made me think, well, if you're using it for personal growth and development, then you have to be familiar with more than just your first two functions. And that reminded me that I don't think that you and I have done a podcast on almost like the ideal relationship one should have with their stack or their cognitive function stack. I think we've talked a lot about it in general and talked about our relationship with, our auxiliary or co-pilot function, our tertiary 10-year-old, our inferior 3-year-old. But we haven't really drawn out a map of how a person might ideally go through all of these functions and the relationship they can build with each of them in order to really optimize using the system for growth and development. So I thought that maybe in this podcast we could talk about it at 20,000-foot view, talk about the relationship we can have with each of these functions. And then when you know your type, then you can take this map and then overlay it on top of your function stack.
As a quick side note, and people that are more advanced, bear with me here, but for the new listener maybe, or someone that may not know what Antonia is talking about when she uses the word cognitive functions, the words cognitive functions, what does that mean? We're talking about the mental wiring of your mind, how you learn information, make decisions. We have a lot of resources at personalityhacker.com to familiarize yourself with. One of the best searches you can do there is the CAR model. And this will give you a framework for how your mind is wired based on your personality type. So if you're a little bit new to Myers-Briggs and some of the deeper things we're going to talk about today, that's a great resource for you to go find out more so you can follow along in this discussion.
So we've recently been doing a coaching course with Dario Nardi that is based on a publication a book he just recently published called The Magic Diamond Method. And the coaching course is, it's him taking the model that he developed in Magic Diamond and then helping it apply it to specific people's lives and what it would look like for their individual type.
By the way, the book's downstairs. It just came in yesterday.
Oh, nice. Oh.
So we got to tell him we just got a copy.
Very cool. So the map, what I love about the Magic Diamond book is that Dario effectively lays out a map of personal development using your functions. And I want to, first of all, go buy it because it's an amazing publication. I say that as somebody who read an early copy of it before we got it shipped. So yeah, I got access to an early digital copy. It's a fantastic book. It has great information in it and some information that I think is things that I have, like what I love about Dario is that he always ends up connecting or giving me the final piece to a puzzle. And I've been thinking some of these thoughts for a long time, and then he filled in some of the dark spaces for me, and then as soon as that happened, the system just became super clear in front of me, which is great. So what I loved about this book is that there were puzzle pieces that I had I didn't quite have a grasp on yet. Like I didn't quite have that piece of information. And then as soon as it was delivered, I'm like, okay, now the entire picture is clear.
Oh, and what I love about it is he talks about all 8 cognitive functions for your personality, and not just describing them. He gives a growth path for all 8 functions for you as a person, not just the first 4 in that car model. If you're new and you're going to go look at, there's a whole nother set of 4 functions that are under the surface, basically, in your personality that we don't really talk about much. And I love the fact that not only does he talk about those here, but he gives growth paths for those functions to be woven into your life.
We've actually deliberately not talked about those 4 functions beyond the 4-function stack in the car model. And we've gotten a lot of requests to do so. Like they're called shadow functions. It's your function 5th through 8th function. And there's a lot of information out there about those functions, but we usually don't talk about them much. And one of the reasons why is we weren't sure how to talk about them in a specific growth map. Like we don't really want to talk about stuff unless it has a growth orientation to it, unless it can be applied. We don't really just like descriptors. Diagnostics are interesting to a certain point, but if there's no prescription for it, then you're just in a hamster wheel of going, oh, okay, so this is what this is, this is what this is. And there are other systems that talk about like the 7th function being the point of least resistance. And you'll see that online. People call it POLR. And they'll discuss each other's POLR, point of least resistance, that 7th function. And while there is some description around there's not really a follow-up to what to do about it. So like I mentioned, what I loved about doing this coaching mentorship group with Dario, hosting it, and then also the book, is there was a couple pieces of information that as soon as I read them, I went, that's the map. That's how you use those 4 functions. So I think that you'll probably hear us talk a little bit more about those 4 functions because there's a growth opportunity here. There's a map. There's not just diagnostic. There's also prescription. And until we had that with some real substantial research behind it, there's just a reluctance to go there. And I think it's because now the communication can be very clear of the methodology for how to interact and engage with these functions, and then have a way to get to the other side. Now, before we talk about the 8 functions and the relationship, the quote unquote ideal growth path to go through all of these functions and to create a good relationship with them, I think one thing should be mentioned, and this is something that Dario mentions all the time. I actually don't remember how much he talks about it in the book. I just know that he talks about it a lot in the mentorship program. And this is this idea of one-sidedness. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about one-sidedness in a future podcast, but the purpose of the relationship of this map of your cognitive functions, your 8 functions, is an attempt to deal with one-sidedness. One-sidedness being an imbalanced personality that has trouble getting out of its own perspective, getting out of the box it creates for itself. And we all put ourselves into a box to some extent. When people talk about personality types, they don't like it because it puts them in a box. Most people don't realize that they don't like that it puts them in a box that they didn't craft themselves. Like everybody puts themselves in a box. That's just kind of human nature. And if you want to be the person who creates your own box and closes the door, then the idea that a typology system might describe you differently than the box you've already crafted for yourself is offensive. And one of the nice things about typology systems is that they encourage you to see outside the box you crafted for yourself and to see yourself in a different way with different features or different characteristics, maybe even validating parts of who you are, but also highlighting the things that aren't so good. And when we go from the box that we created about ourselves, our identity, and we notice that there's other descriptions, sometimes we can take those descriptions and then bring them into the box that we created. So we just grab all those characteristics and traits, and then we just make them more so a part of this box. That is who we are. And that's identity. That's personality. One of the things that going through this sort of sequence of function relationship one of the things it can do is it can get you outside the box. It can keep it from being so one-sided. It forces you to see a bigger picture, more expanded territory, not only of the world around yourself, but also of yourself in the world. You get to see a bigger picture of yourself and how you can relate to others. And so it's really helpful in that way. So as Joel mentioned, and I know he says it every time we mention cognitive functions, he talks about going online and looking it up and figuring it out. But just as a note, the reason why he does that, FYI, if you're a person who listens to us all the time and you hear us talking about functions and then Joel has to say, go to the website and check it out, one of the reasons why we do that is my brother's a science fiction writer. And he mentioned that something that happened in the 90s, particularly, is that science fiction writers started writing not for their audience, but for other science fiction writers. And science fiction stopped being fun because now it was all just really hardcore, making sure that all of the science in science fiction was super dialed in. And I think the secret to the success of some of my brother's writing and some of the programs that have been created from it is because he and his writing partners stopped writing for other writers and started writing for fans. And so they wanted to make it accessible. And so whenever we start talking about cognitive functions and get real deep, Joel just says, remember, we're not science fiction writers writing for other science fiction writers. We have to have a broader range of appeal. We have to make sure that people who are new to the subject also feel very welcome and they have an on-ramp. So, as Joel mentioned, go look up some of this information to make sure that you are familiar with what is called your cognitive function stack, or what we've called the CAR model. And for those of you who maybe haven't ventured out too much into the shadow functions, because you follow our work, and again, we have not traditionally gone in that arena very much. We haven't talked about it because we didn't want to talk about it again until we had prescription. We are going to fillet out a little bit about what the function stack is, including all 8 cognitive functions. And there will be benefit for you taking some notes maybe here, or really getting an idea of what all 8 of those functions are. And those of you who are already familiar with this concept, we'll be getting to more of the meat of it in just a moment.
In our soundbite world, and if you've been around Personality Hacker for any period of time, we have put a ton of focus and effort and emphasis on helping you focus on and grow your auxiliary co-pilot cognitive function. We often say that if you take one message from us, if we get 5 seconds to 10 seconds to tell you something, it's grow your co-pilot auxiliary cognitive function, because we believe that's the great launching pad for using Myers-Briggs and the personality system of Myers-Briggs for personal growth in your life. It's the biggest bang for your buck. It gives you the best return on investment if you're going to spend time. It rounds you out the most and gets you started on a path of exploration, down a road to expand all of your functions, but that's the great starting place. And so you've probably heard us talk a lot about that. And I think in some ways we maybe have over-communicated that to some people. In some ways, maybe not. I'm sure a lot of people haven't taken the message and gone off the rails with it, just doing that. But there's more to developing yourself and your personality than just your co-pilot auxiliary cognitive function. There's much more. You can spend a lifetime working on your personality and developing yourself, but that's a great place to start. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like beyond that one message we often give. Now, we've talked also about growing your tertiary or 10-year-old function. We've talked a little about what you do with your inferior or 3-year-old function. There's some aspirational elements there. There's often great benefit to you in your personality. So we've touched on some of these aspects, but I think Dr. Nardi has a great framework for the sequence of how you can look at yourself and look at your cognitive functions and to develop in a specific order that will also help you get the most from that experience.
So the first thing you should know is that the 5th through 8th function is the same as your 1st through 4th, but in the opposite attitude. So if you already have your 1st through 4 cognitive functions, which you should be able to find, it's effectively the CAR model. You should be able to find it anywhere. Your dominant function, like take for example for me, as an ENTP, my dominant function is extroverted intuition. that means that my fifth function will also be intuition, but it will be the introverted version. And the same thing with my sixth function. It mirrors the second. So as an ENTP, my second function is introverted thinking. That makes my sixth function also thinking, but the extroverted version of it. It would be extroverted thinking. My third function is extroverted feeling. That makes my seventh function introverted feeling. And my fourth function is introverted sensing. That makes my eighth function extroverted sensing. So you take the four functions that are in your car model, or just basically your four function stack, and you take the same functions but reverse the attitude. Now, attitude is the technical name for introverted or extroverted, which direction it is pointing. Anything that's introverted has an introverted attitude. Anything that's extroverted has an extroverted attitude. So again, take those first four functions and just reverse the attitude. And now you have your 5th through 8th function. In this map that we're going to be talking about, you still put the emphasis on the first and second functions. So as an ENTP, it is still crucial and vital for me to do work to develop and exercise my first function of extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. All of the different aspects of it, all the different pieces of it. It's not just a brainstorming session. It's not just travel. Extroverted intuition does a whole host of things. And when you really start to understand the textures and the layers of what is involved in that, and you're able to create a context that doesn't punish it, create a context that actually rewards it, put yourself in that position a lot, understand the benefits that it has for you, and to put yourself in a flow state using it. When you're able to create a life that is ergonomic for your dominant function, then at that point, it's time to develop the second function. And the second function for me is introverted thinking. We call it accuracy. It is whatever it is for you. You'll want to have the same qualities portrayed in that second function as you've just developed in your first, which is understand a complete picture of what this function does. Introverted thinking, we call it accuracy, but it's not just about precision. It's not just about honesty. There's a lot of things that introverted thinking does. And then when I, as an ENTP, create a lifestyle that not only doesn't punish it, but rewards it, understands it, creates an environment that's ergonomic and accepts it as an important piece of the sort of the social ecology, then I have developed that second function. So I'm describing it not just in the way of personal development, but I'm also talking about it in ways of now you're bringing it to the world. Now you're able to plug into the rest of society using this function, and you've developed it well enough that the rest of the world understands its purpose and understands why it's so important and meaningful. So that would give you kind of a full picture of what it means to have it developed. You're not just doing it, but you're doing it well enough so that you can gift it to your environment.
Now remember, none of these functions live in isolation. They are tied to what's called a polarity, meaning that they have an opposite to them in each of their positions, basically. So, for example, that dominant or driver function that Antonia talked about for her personality and your personality, whatever that is, there's an exact opposite cognitive function sitting in that same car model we talk about right behind it. It's the opposite of it. So, for example, Antonia is extroverted intuition. That means her fourth function, her inferior function, or what we've nicknamed the 3-year-old function, is the opposite of that. It would be introverted sensing, to be opposite of extroverted intuition. The same thing would apply for the second position, or the co-pilot position. The opposite of that function for Antonia, introverted thinking, the opposite of that would be extroverted feeling. And that's at that third tertiary or 10-year-old position in the car model. So you have opposite cognitive functions in your car model in the back seat of the car, metaphorically speaking, that pretty much as you develop the first and second function, by definition, you kind of have to develop the back seat as well, because you have to balance those along with the front seat as you work on it. So we don't really talk about going first, second, third position in the functions, because the third function, that tertiary or 10-year-old function, is kind of woven into the co-pilot development. So as you develop your co-pilot, part of that development is weaving in the balance, the tension point between that co-pilot secondary function and that tertiary 10-year-old function.
Right. So to break that down just a little bit, For me, development of my auxiliary or co-pilot function as an ENTP, and this is what Joel mentioned before, this is our soundbite, develop the auxiliary. And one of the reasons why we say that, and we've mentioned this before in the podcast, is that we have a natural attraction to our dominant or driver function. And so we have a tendency to fight for the right to use it. When I mentioned that we want to bring it to the world, we'll know that we have developed it when it's not just something that we use, but we can also bring to the world. When we can't bring it to the world, when the world fights against it, that usually creates a lot of depression in us. And so we'll oftentimes fight for the right to use that function. And it's really rare. It does happen, but it's rare when a person completely pushes that function out or has an environment that's so hostile to it that it's not able to use, that the person is not able to use that dominant function at all. So that dominant or driver function usually gets some airtime. There's almost always more work to do because it is a very fleshed out, multifaceted, multi-layered function. So there's usually more work to do there. But because it is a pleasure most of the time to use it, and it's something we go to so naturally, the reason why we talk about going to the auxiliary is because most people have created a lifestyle for themselves where they can be there. Like they usually try to carve out a niche for themselves where the environment allows for that. Now, whether or not they've created a lifestyle where they're gifting that to the world around them, where they're able to truly manifest it in all of its beautiful wonder, and the rest of the world, is grateful for the person bringing that gift to them, that may or may not be happening. And that's when I say, we say there's always work to be done. It's usually because we can become better at refining it. But we oftentimes want to be there, so we intuitively do that for ourselves. That's a gift we give to ourselves. That auxiliary function, though, we may not have as much control over it. That is to say, we might not be able to use it in a way where everybody appreciates it. As an ENTP, I in particular am reminded, or have been reminded my entire life, of me using introverted thinking in a way that the rest of the world wasn't super happy about. I was a little clumsy with it when I was younger. And that's one of those functions that when you're clumsy with, the rest of the world will definitely give you the feedback that you're not using it well. And so it took some time. And for most people, it takes a little bit of time to really refine that part of who they are to a place where they are giving it as a gift to the rest of the world, that the ecosystem is accommodating for it and really appreciates it. That said, my observation has been that most of the people who do work in their auxiliary function, just like Joel was mentioning, by nature have to balance it with the other side of the coin or the other side of the polarity, in my case, extroverted feeling. I haven't seen anybody do real substantial work in their auxiliary function where they didn't naturally start to balance out that second and third function together. And the reason why is we actually are in some ways more attracted to that third function because it's in the same attitude as our first. In fact, we've talked about this many times in podcasts about loops and the relationship that the dominant has with the tertiary or the driver and the 10-year-old. So we have a lot of attraction to that function. And oftentimes we're overusing it. We're using it in a way that's not really appropriate for us to bring our best gifts to the world. And so when we develop the auxiliary, there's almost like an arm wrestle that happens between the auxiliary and the tertiary, or that co-pilot and 10-year-old. And doing development work in that co-pilot or auxiliary function, by definition, means doing work in our 10-year-old or tertiary. Because what we're doing is we're reining it in. We're understanding how to use it in service of the auxiliary. We're understanding how to sort of season our auxiliary function with it. So for me, as a person who uses introverted thinking and then extroverted feeling or harmony as my 10-year-old or tertiary, I've discovered that, that phrase that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That's very much a statement to people using introverted thinking of the importance of bringing some extroverted feeling in, right? You can't just bang everybody or beat everybody over the head with information and truth until they understand what your intent is, what your motivation. Your motivation is because you love them and you care about them and you want good things for them. And if that's not your motivation, you're not going to get very far. So either you bring in more clarity around how this information is a gift to others and is in their best interest, or you actually need to develop some compassion and empathy for other people So your work is either make that clear in your messaging or to actually do the work of creating more compassion and empathy so that your information and data has more potency in the world. Whatever it is that you need to do, in order to actually do development work in your auxiliary, you almost always have to do some work in your tertiary to round it out.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. The reason why we're talking about this and going on about it, because we have talked about this before, is the sequence recommendation that Dr. Nardi talks about in the Magic Diamond doesn't focus on the third or tertiary function after the second one. So basically, he recommends that we focus on our dominant driver function first. We do the work around that, and that is something that we usually enjoy doing because, again, that's how we like to see the world. That's how we like to engage with the world. That's how we like to show up. And then the little harder work is that co-pilot auxiliary function. That's a little tougher because we have to wrestle control from our tertiary 10-year-old. We have to round ourselves out in an attitude we don't like to spend as much time in. If we're introverts, we have to be more extroverted. If we're extroverts, we have to be more introverted. So it's a little challenging for us. And then he recommends from that point to jump from the second function and jump all the way to the sixth function. So this is going to be the function that is similar to your co-pilot or auxiliary. So it's still, for example, for me, my co-pilot is an introverted feeling function. My sixth function will be extroverted feeling. So it flips the attitude of my co-pilot or auxiliary function. So first, second, sixth function is the sequence that Dr. Nardi recommends that we do with intent, with focus and intent. And it might feel like we're skipping past opportunities for development and growth with our tertiary 10-year-old or inferior and 3-year-old. But remember, these are getting wrapped in automatically. We talked about the opposite polarity, right, to those two dominant functions, your driver, dominant function, your co-pilot auxiliary. By definition, when you work on those, you have to kind of weave in some of the elements of that 10-year-old and inferior function too.
Well, I would argue that one hasn't developed the first and second or dominant and auxiliary functions unless they've weaved in aspects of their third and fourth, that tertiary and inferior.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's why I mentioned that auxiliary function, when we harp on about, develop your co-pilot, that auxiliary function, that second function. The reason why we do that is because it oftentimes naturally becomes a push-pull relationship with that third or tertiary function. And then when a person has really nailed that down, that third function also gets attention because they understand its proper place, they understand how to weave it in, and they're forced to develop it so that, again, that second auxiliary function has its full potency. And almost everybody has this. In your case as an ENFP, Joel, your auxiliary or second function is introverted feeling, as you just mentioned, or authenticity. That's the ability to have an impression point of yourself, that the desire for expression, and to impress the world, like with almost the actual definition of impress, or which is to press yourself into the rest of the world, requires you to develop enough extroverted thinking or effectiveness to have an impact. So it's not just a matter of like understanding yourself and getting fully into who you are and having full authenticity. It's also the capacity to understand your purpose, like to have full alignment with your intent and motivation, and then to bring that into an expressive element to the rest of the world. Well, how do you do that if you don't have any capacity to make something happen? How do you impress upon the world your aligned purpose, your aligned motivation and intent, if you can't make anything happen in a way that other people can experience it, right? Like it just kind of falls flat. It's a wet firecracker. So that is crucial for EFPs to develop that tertiary or 3-year-old, or not 3-year-old, the tertiary or 10-year-old function. It's crucial for people using introverted feeling as an auxiliary to have enough of that woven in to make the impact that they want to make. And the same dynamic applies to the dominant and the inferior functions, or the driver and the 3-year-old. Now, there's more stratification between these two functions. The polarity is more stretched out almost. And so it's much easier to see how that dominant applies itself to the world and gets expressed. It's much easier to observe that in people's personality. But there's a requirement to weave enough of that inferior or 3-year-old function into it so that it doesn't become lopsided. When that happens, then that dominant function, it might still have an attractiveness to it, to the person using it, but it doesn't really have any ballast. And so the fun of using it stops becoming fun because you end up having all sorts of like bad consequences. I always think of the Joker. I probably quote the Joker way too often in the podcast in this particular quote. But the Joker says, "Do I look like in what was it? The Dark Knight?"
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm talking about Heath Ledger's version of his incarnation of the Joker in The Dark Knight. He says, "Do I look like a man with a plan? I'm a dog chasing cars." Anytime you have a dominant function that is overly expressed and missing components of the inferior as a ballast, that's what that dominant function becomes. Even if you're using a planning function like extroverted thinking, it looks like you have a plan, but really without its natural counterpart, then you become a dog chasing cars. You're doing it for its own sake, and you end up having a dog chasing cars set of consequences. You end up not being able to, sort of miss the arrows that life shoots at you because you're so in your experience, you're so in your sort of the box you've created for yourself that you're unsure of why you're doing what you're doing or how to go about doing what you're doing. Like you're so in your experience that you can't actually bring any of your gifts to the world. So true development of that dominant or driver function requires you to weave in components of that fourth function, that inferior. And when you get that, we've talked about it in terms of it being your aspiration. And you don't have to develop it in the sense that, you've seen people who have really strong legs but not super strong arms, or the opposite. Like if you're a person who doesn't have strong legs and you're working out a lot, you don't want to skip leg day. But you just may never have those big, beautiful calves that you see on other people. You still want to exercise them, but you don't want to exercise them to a point where you get frustrated and depressed that you'll never have these like big calves.
Well, why do I have baby legs from Rick and Morty in my head now?
Right. Right. Yeah. You might just be a person who has baby legs, and that's just all there is to it. Now, you do
regular legs to come in and help you.
That's right. That's exactly it. Now, you might never end up having the same amount of acumen in your inferior function that somebody who has it as their dominant will. In fact, I don't even want to use the word may not. You will never have the same amount of acumen that in your inferior function that somebody has in their dominant. It's just not going to happen. But you do need to have it represented, and you need to have it in your conscious awareness. And you do need to set circumstances up in life that allow you to pull from it. And it's good to start recognizing, just have an awareness around all the times that you use it. Earlier today, I was sending out a newsletter that needed a graphic, and I just couldn't think of a graphic to put in it. And so I typed into Google, well, how's everybody else doing it, right? I was like, coupon codes for blah, 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 blah. And I wanted to see how other people used graphics in their coupon codes. And that was me using SI. I went back to a source that showed me how a whole bunch of other people are using it. And in that way, I was able to creatively create my own by taking those ideas. That's me pulling on my introverted sensing, my inferior function, in order to fuel my extroverted intuition to create something different, something creative. So recognizing all the different ways that you use your inferior, that 3-year-old function, all the different ways that You can incorporate it into your life and honor and respect it, and then understanding that it is your aspiration. All of that is crucial work to truly developing that dominant. So when we talk about developing the first and second or the dominant and auxiliary functions, we are in some ways by definition also addressing the third and fourth function or that tertiary and inferior. We are in some ways talking about weaving those aspects of who you are into your growth work. So as Joel just mentioned, Dario recommends first, second, and sixth. But going to the sixth function after the second, assume you are already weaving in the third and fourth function into the development of the first and second, because you can't really truly develop them unless you have a balancing act, sort of like that juggling balancing act already down in the third and fourth. Okay, so
what about the fifth, though?
Yeah.
Why are we skipping past that?
I was just about to say, I'm sure that that's the first question people have. What about your fifth function? Where does that come? Well, so in order to understand the relationship with the fifth function, I think we should talk a little bit about your relationship with your sixth. Your sixth function is a function that, again, is the attitudinal opposite of your second. So for me, that would be extroverted thinking, because my second or auxiliary function is introverted thinking. And
for like an INTJ, it would be introverted thinking.
Right.
For an INFJ, it'd be introverted feeling, right, and so forth. You just flip these attitudes for your co-pilot auxiliary.
Right. For an ISP, it would be introverted sensing. For an for an ESJ, it would be extroverted sensing. Right. So you just take whatever is your second or auxiliary function and flip the attitude. So I suspect, actually, I don't think Dario said this. This was just, again, he gave me missing pieces of the puzzle, and then as soon as I locked in some of those missing pieces, like the whole pattern became very clear to me. And he doesn't really talk about your antithetical relationship with that sixth function. He just mentions how important it is for development. But I actually think that we tend to have an antagonistic relationship with the sixth function, or at least that's been my observation. Maybe not as much for people who have a perceiving function as their sixth. It might be, actually. There might be just as much of an irritation or frustration with the sixth function, no matter what kind of function falls in there. But definitely for those who have judging functions. And you can see this in all of the online fights that people have between, say, introverted feeling and extroverted feeling. A person who has extroverted feeling as their sixth function, like somebody who's maybe an EFP, they have extroverted feeling as their sixth function, they're going to feel like extroverted feeling or harmony is very much trying to police their expression and their behavior. And the opposite is true. A lot of times IFJs see introverted feeling as being, sort of really self-centered and always thinking of itself first before it looks outward to other people's needs. There's very famous battles on that front. As a person who has extroverted thinking or effectiveness as my sixth function, I can definitely see all the ways in which I've found that function to feel very much like it's running ramshot over things that I believe are very important to address. Like, why did you come to this conclusion? And can you show me all your thought processes? And why do you believe everybody has to do it this way? And the opposite can be true. There's a lot of ITJs out there that find introverted thinking to be frustrating. Like it belabors thoughts. It's too much in its theoretical ideas of what should be happening. And at the same time, I think that there's also some admiration that comes along with it too. Like, I admire what people who use extroverted thinking, particularly as a dominant auxiliary, can make in the world. And I think that there are some admiration that IFJs may have to people using introverted feeling, like their ability to be self-referencing and to stand for what's important to them. So there is a little bit of an antagonistic relationship with this sixth function. But my suspicion is that the antagonism comes when you are trying to develop your auxiliary, because it is in some ways in competition with it. There's a competitive nature to extroverted feeling and introverted feeling. When you're trying to develop extroverted feeling, sometimes it feels like those that are using introverted feeling are frustrating it, and vice versa. When you are trying to use introverted thinking, sometimes it feels like those who are using extroverted thinking are frustrating it, and vice versa. And I would actually imagine the same would be true for the perceiving functions. I could see how somebody trying to develop introverted sensing, like an ESJ, would get frustrated by extroverted sensing's desire to pull them out of that and to get back into the fast-pacedness of the world. And I would see somebody who's trying to use extroverted sensing getting frustrated with introverted sensing's desire to do everything in the same old way and having to templatize things, or at least, in their mind. So there are you can kind of see why people would push away that sixth function. And when they have locked in and built a very confident relationship with the auxiliary, suddenly that sixth function isn't as threatening anymore. Because I think the reason why we push it away is its disruption that it causes when we're trying to develop our second function. We need confidence when we're building our second function. We need confidence in the function itself and the gifts that it brings. We need confidence in our ability to develop it and to use it well. When we start using that second function, and particularly if we haven't spent our lifetime developing it, it makes us feel kind of insecure. It makes us feel like we're doing something wrong. Sometimes it can be a quite tumultuous experience.
It's like, to me, the metaphor of rehabbing a house. Like everything's torn apart, the walls are knocked out. It's going to look great when it's all done, but while you're building and redesigning and remodeling the home, it looks terrible. There's dust everywhere. It's a big mess. You can't sleep in it sometimes. You've got to wait for the work to be finished.
Yeah, exactly. And so while you're doing that work, anything that feels like a disruptive element is something that you're going to have some antagonism towards. You're going to be upset, right? I'm like, hey, listen, I'm trying to develop my second function here. Anything that comes along and tells me that I'm doing it wrong because I'm not doing it like they're doing it, or they think I'm supposed to be doing it like they want it to be done, right? Like that's going to be something that we push away. But once we gain confidence in the function, we gain confidence in our ability to use it, we start understanding how it's part of the gift that we give to the world, and then we rest into it and we feel real settled. Now we're ready for that sixth function. And that sixth function can now round us out. Once again, it prevents us from being too one-sided. It gives us a perspective of how the quote-unquote other half lives. And it gives us an ability to, like in my case, using introverted thinking, one of the number one things that extroverted thinking has taught me is the need to simplify messages and speak in a sequential order, particularly when it comes to creating programs. If you've ever seen any of our programs from earlier days, it's very introverted thinking. Particular podcasts too. It's all over the place sometimes. I give you a bunch of information, lots of data points, and it's up to you to sort them out and figure them how you're going to use them out for yourself. I have finally learned the lesson of the importance of teaching things in a sequential order, building concepts on top of themselves, leaving a little digital data cookie crumb trail so that you go from A to B to C to D, and how much easier it is for people to understand and learn concepts when you've got a map laid out in front of you. I never really truly integrated that before, but that's because I was working on introverted thinking and I needed to. And once I got that locked in, all of a sudden extroverted thinking started giving me all these gifts, all these wonderful ways of taking what I had naturally and dialing it up.
When I think about growing my sixth function, I think, blah. It's just like, oh, come on. Are you kidding me? Like that's like the gut reaction. And I mean, for me, it's extroverted feeling. And I love extroverted feeling in other people, like other things, but in myself, like
when you're being taken care of by it.
Yeah, I mean it's great, right? I think it's awesome, but now I've got to like figure this out, and so I'm struggling with this. And one thing that Dr. Nardi did say during the Magic Diamond workshop we were running with our 12 students, he said, you can think about this function as developing it itself and focusing on growing it, and that can be valuable. And also, you can think of it in just terms of making space for it in your life. And that hit me hard to think in terms of like, there's real work to do. I can actively do some work there, but also I can just make space for it to be present in my life. In other words, when someone shows up, maybe an FJ shows up and they want to create harmony in a situation, and I'm frustrated because the authenticity, the truth of the situation is going to be supplanted by this harmonious framework they're trying to bring in to make everybody feel good. my instinct has always been to fight and make sure we get the real authenticity out. And I'm realizing there's value that extroverted feeling brings to create some of these spaces for people. And so I'm making more space for it. I'm realizing calibration can happen. I don't have to say the thing in the way I want to say it. Maybe I can say it in a different way that lands better with another person. So I'm learning a lot from what Dr. Nardi said. I think that's a really great point he brought up, is that making space for this in your world can be powerful in and of itself, even as you're trying to develop or work on it.
Particularly as a first sort of layer. Like, there are functions, and by the way, the 7th and 8th function, they're not really on the map. Like, the thing you need to do for the 7th and 8th function is what Joel just said. You need to make space for them in your life. They need to be able to exist without resistance, and just allowing them to happen around you and allowing them to happen within you sometimes is the best you're going to get with those 7th and 8th functions. They're not really high leverage to develop. When it comes to the 6th function, it is important to develop the 6th one, but the first layer of that is just making space for it. Once you can make space for it and you turn the unconscious conscious, you start to recognize all the different ways in which it shows up well. And one of the best ways to do that is to understand its place in society. We did a series of podcasts about each of the cognitive functions in the world, basically what position they play in the world and why they're so crucial. If you have your 6th function as still something that you have an antagonistic relationship around, I recommend going and listening to that podcast and then trying to imagine a world without that, right? Like a world where that is not represented at all. And at first that sounds really awesome until you really think about the consequences that would come along with having that just not be anywhere, and all of the different things we'd have to do to compensate for it. And it wouldn't be okay. Like, it would not be a pretty environment. So the first layer of that 6th function is making space for it in your life. But it is something that needs to be developed. So after you make space for it, then it's a matter of then actively trying to develop the muscle of it, bringing elements into your life and being a person who also represents it.
But if you feel like I do around it, whatever your 6th function is, this is a great on-ramp, a great access point to give you access to growth, which I think is the first step.
Yeah, exactly. So it looked like we hopped over the 5th one, right?
Well, we did.
We did. We went 1, 2, 6. So what about that 5th function? Where does it play? Well, what's interesting is oftentimes we don't have to do much development of the 5th function, kind of in the same way that we don't have to do a lot of development of the 1st, in that we have a bit of an ability to play in that field almost naturally. And you'll see this. You'll see like people who are intuitive dominant, that have introverted intuition or extroverted intuition. You might, if you're an INJ, not be able to keep up with, say, people who use extroverted intuition in a boardroom, like not boardroom, but in a
brainstorming session.
Brainstorming session. Thank you. I always think of brainstorming sessions happening in boardrooms. That's probably not true. But yeah, in a brainstorming session, you might not be able to keep up with them as quickly, but you're not completely confused. It's not like you have no idea what's going on and are unsure of how you landed here. It's just that your process is a little slower and takes a little bit more time. But when you start to play in that field more, if you're an INJ that ends up in, say, a writer's room, which I know of at least one INTJ who's in writing rooms all the time, and she's using her extroverted intuition there, and she's developed it pretty well. Like, that's something that she can sort of play both sides on. I know of ENPs who hang out with a lot of INJs who are capable and able to replicate the experience of going inside and coming up with insights internally, not at the level that they would, say, channel information from the universe using their extroverted intuition, but in a way where they can play in that space and have a modicum of capacity, of competence there. The attitude is, of course, important, but the fact that you're still in an intuitive space, you're in an intuitive space. That's something that is natural for you. And the same thing applies with sensing, with thinking, and with feeling. I mean, you see a lot of ISJs in sports. You see a lot of ISJs doing things that are something that you might naturally ascribe to people using extroverted sensing, Or maybe some ISJs that have a really good ability to be present and to sort of merge with their environment. Like and vice versa. ESPs that have a really, they're very capable of being rooted and finding sort of a place where they, that they have I don't want to use the word template, but they have sort of like they've carved out a space for themselves, and that they have roots, and that they're able to sort of establish themselves in a life that, that very much works for them. So, and have an association with the past and are quite nostalgic and have a way of referencing how things were done before in order to determine how to do things now. So you see this happen a lot where people's first and fifth function don't have a lot of antagonism. They run into people that have that function as their dominant, and they become fast friends. Like there's a lot of simpatico that happens there, which is why the fifth function isn't as important to focus time and attention on. It's something that you really need to put yourself in an environment where it's represented, and if you do, it's more natural to fall into a place where you incorporate the positive aspects into your life. Unlike that sixth function, right, which feels like it's pushing against your ability to develop, the fifth function feels very complementary in your ability to develop. So the fifth one isn't as high leverage to focus in on growth. It happens quite naturally if you put yourself in context that allows it to happen naturally. So it still stays that the developmental path is the first, the second, and the sixth. But in saying that, there's a lot of implication wrapped up in that. Once again, the first and the second mean, by definition, that you are integrating the third and the fourth and creating a good harmony between the first and second and third and fourth. Developing the sixth function means that you've already created that first and second function strong and are wrapping the third and fourth into it, and that you've put yourself in context where the fifth function can also flourish. So when we say first, second, and sixth, that's kind of like the topographical 20,000-foot view. You get more into sort of the weeds of that, and there's a lot of growth that has already happened. There's a lot of dynamics already at play. Now, again, as I mentioned before, the seventh and eighth functions they're not leverage points, right? You're just going to have to more create, like Joel mentioned, an attitude or sort of a perspective that you are making space for those, that they exist in your life, that you have people in your life that maybe cover those bases, like they're helpful to you, that you're not fighting them in your world, that you're allowing them to, to be represented and to do what they do without having to like resist them or actively fight, kind of surrendering to their existence. And they're going to come up for you at times. Like right now, I'm in a time period where I'm very much in my seventh function of introverted feeling. It feels really weird. I don't like it. There's a lot of things about it that are awful. And I'm not really, I don't really think that I would ever be good at truly developing this space. And also here I am. So I'm surrendering to the process. I'm allowing the people in my life that have introverted feeling to help guide me through all of it. I'm allowing it to just sort of unfold in front of me, and I'm not resisting it. I'm not fighting it or thinking something is bad or wrong. And the same thing happens with extroverted sensing. One of the major things that I've attempted to do, and of course extroverted sensing would be my eighth function. One of the major things that I'm always fighting with is being present in my life, being present to the moment, in the here and now, honoring my body, honoring my relationship to where I fit in the timeline in this moment of time. And it's something that I don't think I'm ever going to be, I know I'm never going to be able to do it as well as an SP. I don't think I'm going to be able to do it as well as most personality types, but I can at least be here. I can acknowledge it and not resist it, not think it's bad or wrong to be in this space, but keep surrendering to it. So that seventh and eighth, it's if you haven't already spent your lifetime in first, second, sixth, which is a lifetime's worth of work, then surrendering to your seventh and eighth is what's next, but it's not really a leverage point for growth and development.
Dr. Nardi starts out the Magic Diamond book by saying, if we're going to talk about type, we have to talk about development. And I love the fact that he's written this book with personal growth and development in mind. And throughout the book, there's a ton of exercises and things that you can actively do to grow these functions in your personality and apply them to your life directly. So we really recommend the Magic Diamond, and we would love to develop more content with Dr. Nardi, maybe a full course here at Personality Hacker. We've already done, workshops with clients on a small scale, and I have a vision for us developing something with Dr. Nardi going forward for you to be able to engage more with this material and find growth paths and avenues in all of your 8 functions, not just the first 4 in your car model. So I'm really excited about that coming down the road to work with him on. You've been here part of this conversation. What's coming up for you? What are you having ahas around? What are you having insights around? What questions do you still have? Have you grown some of your functions, those next set of 4, those shadow functions? Have you worked on those? What was that like for you? We want to hear from you, your questions, your comments, most importantly, your stories. We'd love to hear your story around this. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can make your voice heard. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, I bet it's exciting that we're going to finally start cracking into those 4 shadow functions, because we've gotten a lot of requests to do that. But once again, it was like, but I didn't have a map. I had hints of a map, but now we've got prescription, and prescription is always the important thing, not just diagnosis. So if you enjoy this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We also have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can find it at all major retailers. And if you leave a rating and review for us on Amazon for the book, that also helps us out a lot. Of course, we have a suite of programs at personalityhacker.com, personal growth programs that are tailored to your personality type. And if that sounds interesting to you, we recommend you head over to personalityhacker.com and look under catalog.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.